Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jemimah Steinfeld, and I'll be chairing today's session. For those who don't know me, I work at the organization Index on Censorship. We are a historic organization, over 5 decades long, and we arose out of the Cold War as a magazine that basically programmed dissidents and is centered around free expression. And since then, a kind of a campaigning organization has also grown around it. I also used to live in China. That's basically primarily why I ended up at Index, because the censorship story, sadly, is all too present in China. But I, aside from censorship, do also have a great passion in China. I still think it's the most exciting story today. It is, however, one that is deeply problematic and has many challenges in reporting. Some of you might have been at the Jimmy panel next door and would have heard just how extreme the challenges have become. And these challenges, sadly, are no longer just restricted to within the region, but they have kind of gone across. So we will be talking about lots of the challenges, but we'll also be trying to talk about how you can overcome the challenges to do justice to a nation that is fundamentally incredibly interesting and incredibly complex. So joining me today is Cindy Yu, who's assistant editor at The Spectator and presenter of the Chinese Whispers podcast, which is great. You should all listen to it. She was brought up in Nanjing until age 10 and has been in the UK since then. We've got Finbar Birmingham, who is the European correspondent for the South China Morning Post. He covers Europe's relationship with the country from Brussels, and Finbar previously lived in Hong Kong. And we have Maria Vlaskamp, who is former China correspondent, spent 19 years in Beijing, and she's now Asia specialist for the Dutch paper De Volkskrant. I'm going to start with Maria because her story coming to this festival has not been completely straightforward, and she is in the program, but she has not been part of all of the advertisement, and there's been a really, really good reason for that. So I thought that this was kind of the best way to anchor this session. So, Maria, would you just tell us a little bit about why your name was kind of not initially advertised, but also why you actually felt it was important to be part of this event?
Yeah, sure. Is this on? Yes, it is. It's all part of the new low-profile, ultra-low profile that I'm forced to keep after a security incident in October 2022, a few days before the 20th Party Congress started in Beijing. People who we still don't know who they are, who presented themselves as acting on behalf of the Chinese state, found it necessary to carry out bomb threats, framing me as a terrorist suspect. That means my personal information was given to the Chinese embassies in 2 European countries as being a person who was planning a bomb attack on a Chinese diplomatic mission. To make this really bizarre story more, provable or more urgent in the eyes of local authorities, there were hotel rooms booked in my name and paid for by someone, we never found out who, just to show that I was near the area that would be bombed. This, in professional terms, is called swatting, and it's part of a tactic to co-optate authorities in another country to make sure that these authorities do things that, kind of benefit some, in my eyes, possible state actor. So, after that happened, there was a police investigation. There was no way that we could find out who was doing this because the traces were all hidden very carefully. I published about this last year because I thought, okay, the aim is definitely to shut me up. The people who did this to me also demanded that. They said it would stop immediately once I gave in to their demands, and one of the demands was not write about certain topics anymore. I thought, okay, let's just not give in to those demands. I haven't been speaking publicly about it because for me it's the most important that I can continue to do my work reporting on China. And I think there's a risk if I would go public about this story in talk shows and so on after I published it, I would become identified with only this story. And this only one story is not China, and there's so much more reporting to do. So I'm super careful with everything I do, especially when I go to a big public venue. If you would have put my name in the program, I don't know if someone would have prepared a nasty surprise, and I didn't want to ruin my festival. So that's why.
Thank you for sharing that, because I know that it's really, really difficult for you, this, and not completely unsurprisingly. Would you tell us what kind of topics they were saying you shouldn't be reporting on?
I was writing stories about a certain dissident who lives in Netherlands. I had published on the way he was harassed earlier. When I did that, I already found like that guy was harassed so heavily. I thought, is he someone really special, or is this the new normal? So that's why I was following his case. And around the party congress, he was harassed severely again. I was just keeping track of that. And my second story would be, are the Dutch authorities prepared for this kind of transnational repression or not? And if they are not prepared, well, what should they learn? I didn't get a chance to write that story, because when I was working on it, then bomb threats were carried out in my name. And the idea was, okay, don't write about this dissident anymore, erase the previous story that you have done on him from the internet, and also erase all the screenshots shots connected with this intimidation incident, so I would have no proof, and so nobody would believe me. So I just didn't give into that. The best way, what I experienced in China as well, is just, well, what they say in Chinese, 不理他, just ignore it. The moment you start reacting, you start giving them information and feeding it, and then it will become worse and worse. So that's basically what I did.
Given that, you obviously kind of try to keep a bit more of a low profile in terms of this festival. What other kind of precautions do you take personally, and also do you take when you're meeting Chinese sources?
Yeah, that's a hard question, because I don't want to talk too much about specific security arrangements, because it's still only a year after publishing about this incident. I know for sure that there are some people who are not happy with the fact that I spoke out about it. I do plan to resume my field work again. So I haven't really figured out how to do that. The thing is, this kind of thing, it makes it difficult for everyone. It makes it difficult for some Chinese people to engage with me, because it might be dangerous for them. A very simple example is better, I think. At a certain point, my company, of course, who is really brilliantly supporting me, had to involve HR department to make sure that I was mentally safe and sound to resume my work. The person in HR had a Chinese background. So I said, well, maybe that's not the most suitable counterpart for me. And then people said, are you scared of her? I said, no, I'm not, but what if she doesn't feel comfortable with me? What if she's got family here or in China or in Hong Kong? What if this somehow influences her safety? So that is like just a small example of how much you have to think everything through after such an incident, because we don't know exactly who is behind it. We also don't know exactly how serious it was and if they want to do it again. So yeah, then you become super careful. On the other hand, it's also a slow way to find out what you can do and what you cannot do.
I mean, it's really, really exhausting. I find it personally. When I moved back from China, I felt the kind of a border provided security, and also just that most topics you could talk about. There was kind of the 3 Ts, Tiananmen, Taiwan, Tibet, but that's kind of gone. And with the passage in Hong Kong of the national security law, which has a kind of an extraterritorial element baked in, it now just increasingly doesn't feel like anywhere's particularly safe. So I wanted to bring in Cindy and Finbar in that respect, because you both come at it from different places. And you know, Cindy, you obviously are from China, and you have family who live in China, but at the same time, just to kind of quote a few of the things that you've covered on your podcast or that you've written about, the white paper protests, Chinese spy in the UK, hacking, Confucius Institutes, Xinjiang, Taiwan. You've even written critically yourself, you said, you don't have to be a pro-democracy activist to see that for too many people, the CCP is not meeting its side of the deal. I mean, do you, when you're writing these, like, are you sometimes thinking, am I going to kind of cross that invisible line that seems to be kind of getting like wider and wider?
Yeah, I think the 3 T's. The three T's don't have to be updated now, with Xinjiang and Hong Kong as definitely top of the list as well. It is nerve-wracking, definitely, to talk about these things, but I think that, just to explain a little bit about myself, my podcast is the main China coverage that I do, and whenever I can, I also write articles and interview people as well surrounding the China story. So, I'm not putting myself out there in print as much as Mariah and Finbar are. But I'd like to think that in the work that I do, that I'm doing it in a relatively impartial, non-activist way. So in a sense that, we just mentioned the Jimmy Lai panel next door, I'm not trying to be an activist with the work that I'm doing, I'm just trying to report or just trying to analyze through the experiences that I've had and the insight that I do and the family members that I speak to, for example. So that article you quoted from, Jemimah, was when the white paper protest was breaking out in November 2022. And I wrote about it from a personal perspective. I grew up in China, and the national anthem used to be something I was really, really proud of. Proud to be Chinese, I associated that with my patriotism. When those protests were breaking out, some students in Nanjing University sang that national anthem as a symbol of protest against the party, because the first line is, "Rise up, all those who do not wish to be slaves." So I wrote a very personal piece about, how differently that national anthem now sounds to me in light of that political protest. And so I think, maybe that does cross a line, but so far in my work, and I've been doing this work seriously for the last 3 or 4 years, I haven't come across the kind of attention, scrutiny, and threats that Mariah has come across. And so I basically don't know when that bridge is going to be crossed, if it will be crossed, and I just try to think that as long as I'm doing things that, when Chinese would say, 对自己的良心, as long as it's okay for my own conscience, that's what I'm trying to do.
And what about you, Finbar? Because, you work for a paper that is headquartered in Hong Kong. So, did you ever travel to Hong Kong?
I left Hong Kong 3 years ago and I haven't been back. It hasn't been, let's say, it hasn't been something that I've been desperate to do. There's been a lot of other stuff going on in life. But to just add to what Cindy said, I'm very hyper aware of the fact that as a middle-aged white Irish person in Europe, my safety isn't necessarily in question. I have plenty of brave colleagues in Greater China whose safety I would be concerned about, but I'm very realistic to understand that in my own privilege. Obviously the situation in Hong Kong is well documented. We've just heard the Jimmy Lai panel next door. Everybody's always surprised when I say that my work hasn't changed. Nobody's told me what I can or can't write. Anybody who's read my reporting would probably agree that it's not like cowering or not leaving things out. I report about Xinjiang, the 3 T's that you mentioned. I have reported on in depth from a China in Europe point of view. So no, I sort of I'm conscious, obviously, of the broader dynamics, but I don't feel unsafe, yeah.
And why? Because you're conscious of the crackdown on journalists within Hong Kong itself. What kind of shields journalists for the South China Morning Post outside Hong Kong, do you think?
I honestly don't know. I guess just the privilege of being a white Irish person means that I don't have that sort of inherent threat of that lots of Chinese diaspora overseas already face. I think it would be possibly a diplomatic incident to target somebody who's not of that heritage. But I'm privileged enough to not to have given it that much thought. I have not really had to think about how I live my life accordingly.
Yeah.
And I'm aware of how privileged that is in comparison to other people writing about these issues outside of Hong Kong and China.
If I may react on that. That's actually why I published this article, and that's also actually why when the incident unfolded, I immediately got law enforcement involved. Because this happens to people of the Chinese diasporas, Uyghurs, Tibetans, people from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and so on a daily basis. The problem is that law enforcement agencies aren't always equipped to hear them. When those people go to the police reporting, often they are already so far into the rabbit hole of threats. They haven't saved screenshots. They might have cultural or linguistic problems to get their point across. Well, I've got really disappointing news for everyone. I'm a journalist, I'm quite able to articulate what's going on with me. I've been reporting on United Front activities for quite a lot. Law enforcement was involved from the first moment they could be involved. They've put all their manpower on it, and also in my situation, they weren't even able to find the perpetrators. They weren't able to, from a law enforcement perspective, to explain what was going on. It's really frustrating, but yeah, that's also why I wrote it, to increase awareness outside of our circles who are in the know, that this is a situation that we should devote a bit of manpower and study to.
I mean, when you were first back from China in 2019 time, you did a story from a Uyghur woman living in the Netherlands, and she spoke about the threats to her life. I mean, how serious exactly are these threats? Because obviously one of the things is in terms of protecting ourselves, but also, you know, we as journalists, we don't work on our own. We work with a network of people. We're reliant on people for stories. So in terms of our sources, you know, just how, when these people are being threatened in places like the Netherlands, you know, how seriously do you think these threats are? How seriously are law enforcement taking them?
It's a bit difficult to generalize this. When I was in my situation, there were some so-called experts on safety who said, well, you know, Chinese, they usually don't get physical with non-Chinese. Well, great. Before my incident happened, just as Finbar said, Chinese also wouldn't take a white, middle-aged European as a target. Well, yeah. They did. They took me as a target. So I think, actually, we're talking about the T's and Xinjiang and all the topics that we knew were taboo or crossing red lines. It's my impression that under the current party leadership, those old red lines just started to get thicker and thicker, and there are no more visible red lines. It's as if anything can become a red line any moment. So what I then very simply do with my sources is, before we sit down and we're really going to do the interview, it's just to say, okay, how safe do you feel with me being in the room? How safe do you feel talking about this certain issue? And I let them decide what is safe or not. Who am I to decide for them where the threat comes from and how physical it might get, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I know, Finbar, that you do a lot of economic reporting to do with, you know, just trade deals and things that happen in Europe to do with China. But, you know, how much do you intersect with people within China and Hong Kong, and what kind of challenges does that bring, both positive and negative?
Yeah, not that much. I mean, it's being away from China and Hong Kong has obviously made it more difficult to engage with people there. I mean, I was in Hong Kong during the passing of the national security law, and I had people phoning me up the next day saying, you interviewed me 2 years ago, could you please delete my name from your story? And that gives you an idea as to where the lay of the land was. People were not happy to speak to media. And moving away from Hong Kong, to be honest, I've not been incentivized that much to try and persist with maintaining the relationships, probably for those reasons, people's safety, and not to put them in the awkward position of doing that. I've had incidents since I've been in Europe where I've checked with certain people from these communities if they're happy for me to report certain things with their names, and they're not, so I wouldn't do that. So it's about putting your sources' safety before the juiciness of a story, or whatever like one-liner you're going to put in a story that might give you some instant gratification. It's, I suppose, it's journalistically our thrust is always to go for that. So it's, I think, like working in such a highly politicized and in some cases dangerous environment, it's incumbent on us to sort of to take those things quite seriously.
If I can just add, it's so great to hear both of you taking these precautions. I just remember a cautionary tale, if I can say an example of a bad case where this didn't happen. I remember a few years ago, during the time of the Tiananmen protest anniversary, June 4th, the BBC ran a bit of vox popping on Beijing streets where they basically went up to random Chinese people. You remember that as well?
Yeah, it was horrible.
It was awful, with a camera in their face, to random Chinese people on the streets of Beijing asking, do you remember Tiananmen?
Oh my God.
Didn't blur out their faces. And obviously, these people being cold approach are saying, no, I don't know what you're talking about, I don't know what you're talking about, trying to leave. And then the headline that ran was the amnesia around Tiananmen in China. And it's just like, that is not a conclusion you can come to from this method of interviewing. And I was shocked, really, that this only happened in the last, I think it was pre-COVID, but not long before COVID, that A, that was a method that could be conducted, and B, that could be the conclusion that journalists who really should have known better could have conducted. And then it just leads to people who, come to China in a passing way, have a passing interest, maybe never even been to China, then that conclusion lodges in their mind. Tiananmen has been forgotten, which you can make an argument for sure, but not through the kind of methods that it was used at that time. So I think that was a really bad example of how to report on China fairly and safely.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, probably part of the problem is that we seem to be entering a place where either whether it's out of fear or how much harder it is to get a visa to go and report from China, that we're actually getting less information, and that's actually feeding into disinformation. And I have my own personal story where, which relates to someone in this room actually, where I pitched an article that was about the idea that Peppa Pig and Winnie the Pooh were banned in China, because that was the news headline that I kept on seeing. And I was very intrigued as a parent whose kids are reading all these kind of books and watching these TV shows, as well as from a censorship angle. But when I went to investigate, I realized I was speaking to people in China, and it just wasn't true. There are memes, memes of Winnie the Pooh can be banned, and some gangster videos of Peppa Pig are banned in China, but not Peppa Pig videos themselves. Yeah, I know gangster videos of Peppa Pig doesn't sound like a sentence you would normally hear, but that is actually the reality. And, so even I felt like I had kind of fallen into this kind of mindset of believing the worst. Which actually kind of leads me into, Maria, you wanted to say something, so you quickly dip in and then...
Yeah, well, what I was thinking is, that is an excellent example that you're mentioning. Outside of China, I think the situation is also worsening because, well, it's polarization playing a big part, and then the few people who dare to speak out will become more radicalized, will become more activists. Then, the picture gets more black and white. The voices in the middle, the nuanced voices, they get drowned out by, on the one hand, well, let's say China hawks and people who really only have, want to point the negatives out on China, and then people who are the opposite, everything's beautiful in China. When my incident happened, and after I published about it, I got zillion requests for interviews, talk shows, and everything. I all declined them, not only because of safety reasons, but I was very worried that it would be somehow framed into being an activist journalist, or that all these constant questions about, aren't you afraid, aren't you angry, then I would come across as sort of radicalized. And I think it's really important with every story that you do on China to just start with a clean slate again and look at what is going on, and from all different angles.
Can I just jump in on the polarization? I mean, I think it's a really negative thing. The fact that China has kicked out so many good journalists and we know so little is very dangerous, and over the next few years it's only going to become more important. When I moved back to Europe from Asia 3 years ago, an economist told me, everybody's going to want to talk to you about China, but nobody's going to know what they're talking about. And that has rung true by and large, and I think the debate is becoming less and less nuanced, and I think in Europe it's not quite where it is in the United States, where it's almost like this sort of yellow peril. It's not quite there, but I do worry about the nature of that, and the fact that there's so little middle ground. Everything is so polarized. I mean, this morning last night or this morning, I had a story published about economic complementarity between China and Germany. And the top comment on this story accused me of working for the United States industrial military complex. And when people are drawing such radical conclusions based on what I consider to be fairly balanced economic reporting, and then the other side of the coin is if you say anything or write anything that's in any way positive about China. I mean, I've been threatened by human rights, very prominent human rights activists, for being cut off from their network because I dared to interview Vince Cable, who's the former business secretary of the United Kingdom, a household name in Northern Ireland where I grew up. And so it's very dangerous that, woe is me, a journalist gets abused online. But, these trends tend to not really help nurture a sort of balanced debate.
Yeah, Jemimah, if I can add to that as well. The biggest Twitter storm that I've been victim of in my short career as a journalist has actually come from the China hawk side, because I wrote something supporting China's invitation to the Queen's funeral in the UK a few years ago. Gosh, 2 years ago now. And because I was writing that, I actually had so many very angry China hawks targeting me on social media that I had to just really kind of switch off for the whole weekend. But for basically a piece that said, it's state protocol to invite heads of state unless you're literally in a war with them like Russia. So that was actually quite an eye-opening moment as well.
I mean, you work at The Spectator, which is right-leaning. I'm not going to say it's where the hawks are, but there is...
We have a lot of nearby hawks.
You have some nearby hawks. I mean, but you've done a really good job of being very balanced. I mean, how do you maintain that balance? And do you ever have... I mean, you don't have to tell us in this room if you don't want, but, do you ever have things where your editor is like, no, go in, go that direction, or...
I love my editor. The Spectator is the best in the world. But having said that, no, I think the broadcast medium gives me a bit more leeway, because I'm an interviewer in my podcast. I don't necessarily contribute content. I think about the topics that are good, I think about the guests that are good, and then I interview them and I let them talk. So I think in that way, I try to diversify the content that I'm offering, making it less kind of opinionated. But then in the writing part, I think there is such a thing as received wisdom on China, and I don't, this is just across the board, I think, in English language, where certain stories get much more traction with editors than other stories do. And you have to fight much more for the stories that go against the grain than you do for certain stories that kind of already track with what they think China is. And I've definitely found that. And so I actually sometimes find a more social stories a bit more interesting and easier to kind of write about, like what Chinese women are doing, marriage markets in China, for example, where you can bring the politics and the history in, but it's not about the geopolitics or the trade policy and that kind of stuff. Yeah. And personally, I find that more interesting anyway.
I mean,
China also is suffering. It's not only what you're saying, this kind of bias between from editors going for the stories that get more traction. It's still perceived as a too complicated story. I don't know if I'm not doing my job right, or that China is really complicated. But if I suggest topics which don't fit the mold of stories that get traction or straight up news, then it's like, oh, is it like this, that? No, it's not. It's a little bit different. It's so. And it's like, oh, but that's so complicated. Yeah. So there's a lack of interest and there's a lack of willingness to invest in China, not only because it's dangerous. In my newsroom, everybody now knows that it can be dangerous, so nobody wants to take over this beat. And also, people who were interested, and then we sit down and say, well, you could work together with me on a story like this, that. They're like, oh my God, this is so complicated. I don't want to invest so much in China. I did invest a lot. I'm on this beat for more than 2 decades. And it only gets better when you do it longer. But it's very difficult to make other people enthusiastic for such a time investment.
I think one of the few times I've also kind of come under fire from China hawks was when and Cindy, I think you've also not said this yourself, but you've had someone on the podcast saying this view of that I don't think Confucius Institute should necessarily be closed down, because I think one of the problems is that I thought when I was younger that everyone was going to be speaking Mandarin by this stage, or a different Chinese language or dialect, but actually that doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, it looks almost like it's going in reverse, at least in the UK. And I think certainly that's part of the problem. It's not helping. I feel like we're kind of at a time when the China story is probably, I think, getting bigger. It seems that actually our coverage is getting slimmer for so many reasons, and that's another one.
I think in Europe, I'm one of 2 journalists who write full-time in mainland Europe, not the United Kingdom, obviously, Cindy, about China in Europe, 2 to cover the whole of the European continent, and I think that's tragically short because there's so much going on that's not being reported. There's so much stuff that's just not in the news at all that should be, and it looked as though a couple of years ago when the FT appointed Yun Yang to do Europe, China, that it was going the other way, but you actually see that starting to reverse now. There's now fewer resources in Europe reporting on China in Europe, let's say, than there was 2 years ago. The opposite of what I thought was going to happen.
For background, just for people who don't know, this was a reporter who was in Beijing, and then she's from the UK, and she was at the FT, but she sadly just stepped down to be.
She's going to run for Parliament. Yeah. So she's running for Labour for Parliament. She's fantastic, and she had a very different perspective than I did. She was doing very different stories than what I was doing. Politico had somebody, Stuart Lau, who I'm sure we all know, who's now doing a job reporting on NATO at the same time as reporting on China, and those are 2 big beats, so it's difficult. So I see that there's less coverage now than there was a couple of years ago, and there should be more, frankly.
You said there were some stories that you're frustrated haven't appeared. What kind of stories are they?
Nothing off the top of my head, but there's just I only have 1 pair of arms, sorry, and it's just me covering all of Europe for SCMP, and I would love to have a small team of people. There's just stuff going on, and I'm effectively a Brussels correspondent. There's so much going on in each of the capitals. All of the European countries are on their own journey with China, and there's little bits and pieces of stuff that I try and share with followers on social media and so on. But it's newsworthy stuff that I just don't have the bandwidth to cover, and it's that's what I mean. Nothing in particular, but just the general topic.
Mariah, you moved the
I think
microphone.
One of the things that people don't see because it doesn't show in big headlines is that you really meticulously have to follow things that are happening in China to understand what China is about outside of China. So that means you have to read your Chinese state media, which is, a little bit boring. And you have to be on top of all the developments all the time. And that might not end up in a story. But if you don't do it, you don't understand what is happening in a year from now. I think that is also taking away a lot of people from this beat, because it's not a highly scoring beat. Because if you do it right, you invest a lot of time on just keeping up to date and knowing what is going on. Well, that's not a headline that's going to win you a Pulitzer, right? I was so up to date and I knew what was going on.
Jemimah, just on your point about language skills as well, I think a recent situation I was in is I was asked to follow a story that, and actually I will name the paper, it's Le Monde wrote a story about these government matchmaking efforts in a city in Zhejiang province in China, basically saying that the Communist Youth League and the local Women's Federation were basically getting young people together, helping them do state-sponsored matchmaking because of the falling fertility rate and all that sort of stuff. Great stories, all sound so plausible. We know about China's struggling fertility rate, we know about the way that the government intervenes in the lives of young people, and one of my editors asked me to look into it. So I read that write-up, and in one of the photos, it actually had the QR code of the WeChat group that organized the dating event. So I just, I scanned the QR code, got added into the WeChat group, and started talking to people in there, including the organizer. And what I found out was that actually, he said that they've been running this event for 10 years. They've been running it 5 times a year, and it's mainly to keep young people inside the city so that they're not moving to kind of bigger cities for jobs. It's more of a brain drain story than it was about a fertility story. And it just, that moment for me was such a, I killed my own story, right? So I had to go back to the editor and say, I'm so sorry, the story is not what it is. But it really made me think, because everything that had been reported seems so plausible. it seems so plausible with what we know about China's Chinese context in various different aspects, enough to follow up for sure. And I don't know if the people involved spoke to the organizer in detail about this or not, but then it just became this whole other story, which, I don't know, it was really a kind of reflective moment for me, just thinking how many stories about China kind of get out there without really kind of understanding all dimensions of it. And without the language skill, you might just regurgitate that kind of reporting. And I'm not blowing my own trumpet here, I'm just saying it's so important just to go directly to the source and just actually talk to them about it without your own preconceptions, because maybe you go in there, oh, government matchmaking, you're thinking already is about a fertility story, but actually you have to kind of really question what concepts you go in there with already.
I think one topic that has really typified that over the last few years is China's social credit system. You see so many stories about this sort of dystopian nature of this, and there are critiques to be made about this, but it's not like what is portrayed. And I see a lot of much more talented Chinese speakers than me on social media just despairing every time you see one of these stories that goes back to the old tropes. I think that's like become a sort of fixation on some parts of the Western media to latch on to.
I mean, I feel like it's every day you see something on China's, on the credit system, and it goes up and someone will tweet it out and it will get, thousands of likes. And then there will suddenly be people going, actually, I'm in China and it doesn't work that way, it doesn't work that way, it doesn't work that way. Yeah, I think that's definitely a completely misunderstood story. I am conscious of the time because I think that the probably audience want to ask questions, and we've got about 13 minutes left. So I'm going to open it up to people. Yeah, we've got a few. We've got one at the front, and one there. We've got to wait for the microphone so that everyone virtually can hear. Oh, hello.
Thank you. I'm Xiao. I'm a former Chinese journalist who's now studying journalism in China, in Europe. Thank you for the great talk. I wonder, I have a question for European speakers. Reflecting on what Cindy said, maybe mastery of Chinese language is something, but how do you try to understand the political and social context and also the cultural nuances, which is important for a fair reporting about China? And also, I've been working on this media review on China for 6 years and realized that there's a kind of agenda setting when it comes to China reporting. For example, whatever has been covered by Reuters or South China Morning Post will be followed up quickly by other international media, but some other topics were out of public spotlight. I wonder if you have anything to say about this agenda setting? Thank you.
Well, let me take it then as a European journalist who covers China. When I was working and living in China, I devoted first 1.5 years at Zhonghua Renmin Daxue to get a minimum of Mandarin Chinese. After that, because I really like China, I sort of assimilated into China via personal contacts and via just living there. And then it's basically your working language is Chinese, the people you interview are Chinese, the people you work with, such as your producer or a cameraman or photographer, are Chinese, your friends are Chinese, and then bit by bit, if you're just able to get rid of your Western biased view and just let your mind be filled with what your Chinese friends and contacts explain to you, if they want to explain, that is. Because one of the main hindrances in China is if you ask, hey, I don't understand how come this glass of water is half empty, a lot of Chinese, they will react first with, you foreigners, Westerners, you will not be able to understand China, even if we try to explain, so why should we explain? And I think that was always a great challenge to say, okay, if you guys automatically assume that I'm not able to understand, then it's very hard to have a conversation. But if you're willing to give me a try and see how much you can teach me, I felt that approach really opened up perspectives for understanding much more the language and the culture of the environment I was reporting in.
I would just add that I am fortunate to have a resource of about 350 SCMP reporters scattered around the world who are very helpful in terms of furnishing me out with context and everything. I think in Europe the danger is that if you know anything about China, you're too readily considered to be a China expert. And I would absolutely never consider myself to be a China expert. My language skills aren't strong enough. You know, I've not spent the same amount of time in the country as Mariah has. So, no, I think it's about being humble and understanding and admitting that you don't actually understand all of these things, but maybe surrounding yourself with people who can help you with that.
I think some China experts actually, one China expert recently said something like, you know, the more you know China, the less you realize you know about China.
In that vein, can I just add, this isn't really your question, but I also think a lot of Chinese people don't understand China. I don't think I understand China. You know, I was recently back in China talking to my Chinese family, and they've lived in China their whole lives. But we live in a tier 2 city on the eastern edge of the country. What do we know about the lives of rural people to the west of the country, ethnic minorities, about people who have never even had secondary school education? We know nothing about them either, except for what we learn through paper as well. And I think, you know, it just goes to show what a big country it is. And so even, I think the premise of the question, you know, even the Chinese, I think, often don't, I mean, I don't know, I mean, it's too big a country for anyone to understand, I think. But I just want to point that out to say, you know, I don't think even the Chinese understand.
Just on the second question, isn't that the nature of news? No matter what the news is or where the news is, there's always going to be someone who's there first and the rest will follow. Like if you're covering Africa, or if you're covering Mongolia, or if you're covering business or whatever it is, there's always going to be one or two outlets that get the news first and then everybody scrambles to follow. So I think the China, I guess there are certain media, like we have got big team in China. New York Times has had most of their China reporters kicked out. So the nature of just the sort of head count of journalists in there, I suppose that's also feeding into what you've described.
I would like to add, because I can hear where your question's coming from. When I was reporting, and still when I'm reporting on China, outside of China, if I go to my editorial meeting and I say, well, Chinese state media has this and this and this great story, people either start to like Chinese state media, or they will say, well, anything in Chinese state media is propaganda. And I try to explain to them that sometimes propaganda is a really valuable tool for journalists because it highlights the government storyline, which means, okay, there is a story out there. The problem is there is a certain bias in, let's say, the Western news organization not to take content from Chinese journalists too serious, or immediately say all state media are propaganda. Well, the only thing you can do is just keep on addressing it. So just go into your newsroom every day with whatever you get out of Asian news sources, whether it's state media or not, and keep on pushing those narratives. And if they don't agree with you making a story, then yeah, maybe you can do it as a special project later on. It's just a long haul battle, basically.
We've got a question at the front.
Hi, I'm Emilia Suek, and I'm a freelance journalist now, but before I started working as a journalist, I used to be an academic. And in that time, I spent almost 1 year doing undercover research in the Tibetan parts of China. It was difficult, but actually the funny part of it was that I never actually had any problems, what was very inconvenient to hear from many colleagues in my business back then. But the last time I've been to China was 2015, and it's a long time ago, of course. So I would like to ask you, what shall I expect if I wanted to go now as a freelance journalist and not person employed by a newspaper? And the second question relates to the discussion you had here about this very black and white or very kind of narrow way of reporting about China. I mean, this is a problem of many non-Western countries, that there is this bias in the West and you want only, and the editors think that readers only want this kind of story and not another one. But don't you think that one should have a public discussion about it maybe, to push it a little bit, stretch it?
Okay, so in terms of what to expect, I think, Cindy, you've probably been back quite recently, the most recent of everyone on this panel?
Yeah, I've been back twice in the last year, but I don't think I'm the best to answer your question, only because I don't go back as a journalist. I go back to see my family, I go back all as a tourist, and I also don't go to contested areas like Tibet. You know, the cities are much easier for journalists to come in and out of. So I think maybe I'll chuck this one to you guys. And then in terms to your second question, yes, I think we absolutely need to push that out. And we need everyone to start pushing that boundary out of what's acceptable. For me, as someone who looks like this, it is a hard argument to make because you immediately, you're treated as suspicious by certain people who have preconceptions. So I think we need everyone basically just try to basically push things out. I was so glad that Finbar mentioned the social credit thing. Stories like that, just myth bust them. We have to keep doing it.
Yeah, I'm not up to date on current visa politics because I don't think People's Republic of China is the place I'm going to be safe for a while. So I skipped that question. I just want to give you a bit of caution. I did reporting in Tibet proper and also the adjacent provinces with large Tibetan populations. The danger is not for you there. The danger is for the people who are giving you a cup of tea or shelter if it's cold, even if they don't speak with you. There will be monitoring and tracking, and once you are out of the way and nicely back in Beijing or on your way home, the negative consequences are all for the local people, especially in areas with ethnic minorities, such as Tibet or Xinjiang. People, especially when it's rural areas, they have a certain hospitality culture and even a feeling of being naive, like our government is not going to punish us because we helped this foreigner to sleep here one night when there was a snowstorm, right? Our government can't be that bad, that's harsh to us. Well, I've been reporting in those areas and people helped me, and then after that they got to know the harsh side of their local government. So for the sake of the people who are going to be your informers or helping you, it might be good to consider to come on sort of an official visa, because the moment you go there as a tourist and then you do other work, your work may be safe once you're out, but the people who have helped you will later on get problems for something they did without knowing what the consequences would be.
Okay, we've got about 3-4 minutes. And where there's a person who's had their hand up a while there, and also here. So if we could do them both really quickly. So if you go first, because you've got the mic already.
Yeah, thank you so much. So maybe just as an outlook, what do you think is a good direction for China journalism now that accesses are so much more restricted, and now that you have that political polarization going on? And like, personally, I see like a big potential clash in that on the one hand, there are like strong dangers coming from geopolitical risks and like concrete areas like Taiwan, for example, where media has a kind of responsibility to point out threats. But on the other hand, it also can lead to a kind of dehumanization, and like it can turn China into just like a very abstract, faceless threat. So like how to deal with this ambivalence in reporting, and like, yeah,
let's quickly take yours as well, and then you can all say closing remarks on either of these.
I just came from China. A few weeks ago I was there, and I'm not sure, I am a journalist, but I went there like a tourist, and I make a few videos on my YouTube channel, like tourist, just a tourist. But when you go there, I'm not sure if it's, because it's very easy now to go to China, and it doesn't work. It's very easy to go to China, and I am not sure if it's different to make videos for social media and for outlet media. There is a very big difference, because I'm not sure about this, because I don't know if it's different when you cover for a media or for a social media. What do you think about this?
Okay, so if everyone just says one closing thing potentially related to this, and then thanks.
Yeah, I honestly no idea. Thanks. For the other question, I mean, I guess it's a question for editors more than reporters and correspondents. I hope that newspapers and media will invest in good China coverage. I think it's unlikely that China's going to perform vote for, allow lots of journalists, Western, American, European journalists into China. So I think reporting on China outside of China is going to become more and more important. And I think that having a nuanced view and having an understanding of the big issues, and as you say, not falling into the trap of like binary reporting, good, bad, nothing in between. I think hopefully, here's me touching wood. I hope skills like that and reporting skills like that will be in demand. But yeah, I hope that will be the case.
Mariah, where do you see the future of China reporting?
Well, again, I think I don't need to, I just want to add something to what Finbar said. It's definitely a question for editors. What I think can make us so much stronger, and it's also something I really miss now I'm back in Netherlands. I always used to work with Chinese colleagues together. My researcher is Chinese, or my cameraman would be Chinese. And we would just talk about the story all the time, and we would interpret both what our interviewees were saying. We would make safety plans together, and in that way you also avoid that, you get led on by your own cultural bias. It's like this dialogue that makes stories stronger, plus it increases your resilience if you team up with a group of China journalists. You're not out there on your own when something bad happens, plus you get input from your colleagues, and that makes your story stronger.
And Cindy, early on into your career, where do you hope it goes in terms of China?
Well, I think there's still lots of things that it can do. There's low-hanging fruit, like what's China going to do in Taiwan? But to look at that story in a different way, you could try to learn more about how the Chinese political structure works, how the fragmentation happens between the central and regional governments, between different departments, between the role of the CCP compared to other authoritarian states where it's more of a strongman at the top. That can then inform your reporting on a story like Taiwan, for example, and make it more original. And then to your question about social media, I think it is different in terms of the attention that the state gives you, because there are these kind of blacklisted media outlets like the BBC, Reuters, Financial Times sometimes, the New York Times, seen as very suspicious by the Chinese state infrastructure. And I think social media probably has a bit more leeway in that. And I would count, other minor outlets like The Spectator in that as well, just slightly less away from the scrutiny, and the South China Morning Post definitely is in the scrutiny bucket as well. So I think, yeah, that changes in terms of scrutiny, if that was your question.
Great. Well, I think that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much, everyone on the panel.
Oh, yeah, let's do Chinese.